It is a very great honor to be invited to give tonight's Boyle Lecture. I want to thank those who have invited me, especially Michael Byrne and the advisory board chaired by Lord Cork. I am particularly grateful to Lord Williams for the gift of his response to my lecture, which I'm very eager to hear. I am blessed to live in the San Francisco Bay Area, in a townhome with a panoramic three-bridge view. From our living room, Charlotte and I can see the Bay Bridge, newly reconstructed from a single cantilever, double open span, to now a majestic tower with twin causeways. The iconic Golden Gate Bridge, moving traffic between San Francisco in the south and Marin County in the north, and serving as the door to the Pacific cultures for dozens of tankers each day, and the San Rafael Bridge, which leads families and travelers to parts north of us, stretching from Marin County to Oregon and Washington and on to Canada. In 1981, when I created the Center for Theology and the Natural Sciences at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, and near to the University of California, beg your pardon. I chose the Golden Gate Bridge to serve as a visual metaphor for the developing field of theology and science. The metaphor of the Golden Gate Bridge depicts the many paths between science and theology. The lanes heading north from San Francisco to Marin County represent the standard and well-trodden paths from science to theology, including both natural theology and, to use Ian Barber's term, the theology of nature. Contemporary natural theology focuses on reasons for belief in God in light of science and its philosophical interpretation. The theology of nature emphasizes how theology should be revised and made vibrant for today's world in light of the discoveries of science. These paths, like the northward heading lanes of the bridge, start off going in the same direction, but with different outcomes. Natural theology, traffic turning off to the bustling waterside city of Sausalito, and traffic following a theology of nature heading northwest to the sparkling Pacific Ocean and its distant shores. Over the ensuing decades since creating CTNS, I have been engaged in developing an extensive theology of nature, drawing on physics, cosmology, and evolutionary biology to enrich a Christian theology of creation and redemption. More recently, however, I have also attended to the much less explored path, which, as the bridge metaphor portrays, takes one on the southerly journey from Marin County in the north to San Francisco in the south. This is a relatively unacknowledged path from theology to science. It explores the way theological intuitions, convictions, insights, and worldviews, as well as philosophical and aesthetic arguments, are present in the conversations and debates scientists have about their favorite theories. Here, theology and philosophy can have a creative influence in two distinct ways. One, in the construction of new theories in science, often called the context of discovery. And two, in the choice by scientists between competing scientific theories when the empirical evidence equally supports both theories, oftentimes called the context of justification. This is the path I will take us on today, in which I will playfully dub natural theology in reverse, from theology to science. First, though, let me be clear about what I mean by, quote, theology. I am using this term in a very general sense to include assertions about the existence of God, as found in the sacred texts of the Western monotheisms, as well as assertions referring to concepts such as the One, the unknowable, ultimate reality, the ground of being, and so on, as found in philosophical and mystical theologies, East and West. In this sense, there is Christian theology, but there is also Jewish and Muslim theologies, all with their assertions about the existence and nature of God. And there is Hindu theology, often considered a form of polytheism, or pantheism, or panentheism, or even theism. And there is Buddhist theology with its primarily non-theistic dimension. I even include atheism here as a form of theology, since in denying the existence of God, atheists are making a claim about the truth of the theological concept of God, namely that it's false. So, for example, later tonight, when I refer to the distinguished cosmologist Fred Hoyle and his atheistic beliefs as, quote, theology, I am in no way claiming that he believed in God, which he obviously did not, but I do take his rejection of the existence of God as his theology, or perhaps his anti-theology. It is this general meaning of theology that I will employ here when I explore the role of theology in the discussions by scientists about cosmology and quantum mechanics, my two scientific topics. Let me also acknowledge at the outset that these northbound and southbound paths between theology and science are quite different in the way theological and philosophical convictions, insights, and worldviews are acknowledged and analyzed. Scholars who do natural theology, such as the recent Boyle lecturers John Polkinghorne, Alistair McGrath, Russell Remanning, and Sarah Coakley, pay scrupulous attention to the sciences they are exploring and bring to their analysis the best of philosophical inquiry. Only then do they incorporate these results within central topics in theology, such as the doctrine of creation, human nature, redemption, eschatology, and so on. On the other hand, when we turn to the path from theology to science, we enter a world of anecdotal evidence and personal intuitions, often expressed in pungent ways. A well-known example is Albert Einstein's famous quib that Einstein doesn't play dice, a remark he used to express in a somewhat derisive tone his profound concerns about the seemingly ubiquitous role of radical chance in quantum mechanics. The challenge will be to uncover and analyze how distinguished scientists often rely instinctively on their implicit personal religious and philosophical views when creating a new scientific theory, persuading others to join them, arguing against their competitors. Nevertheless, I truly believe this is a task worth undertaking if it brings credibility to the claim that ideas rooted in philosophy and theology can have a creative influence in scientific research and the wider secular culture to which we are called. I have coined the term creative mutual interaction, or CMI, to stand for the bridge between science and theology, which, like the Golden Gate Bridge, includes paths moving in both ways between them. I hope that tonight, using CMI, creative mutual interaction, I will honor the original intent of the Boyle Lectures, dating back to 1691, by adding to the call for natural theology a complementary path starting from theology and philosophy, and then moving back to science. My lecture will focus in some detail on cosmology in the 1950s and 1960s, and on quantum physics, circa 1900 to 1930. These are prime domains where scientists explicitly invoked philosophical and theological points of view in support of their research choices and in challenging those of their competitors. Even when their language might seem superficial, as in Einstein's remark about God and dice, I believe it alludes to the views these scientists actually held, often subliminally, but occasionally quite explicitly. Their language suggests how these views guided their journey through research science, often for decades, and not just from the beginning of the theory. And in turn, how they continue today to influence contemporary research programs which still flow out of them, programs which are still alive today, 70 to 100 years since the founding theories. So, with this as a background to tonight's lecture, let's start with two examples from cosmology of theology in reverse. First, Big Bang and steady-state cosmology, and then we'll turn to quantum mechanics. Of the many examples of philosophical and theological influences on scientists, my favorite is that of cosmologist and outspoken atheist Fred Hoyle, who together with Herman Bondi and Tommy Gold constructed the, quote, steady-state cosmology in the late 1940s to oppose the dominant theory, Einstein's Big Bang cosmology. Let's start with a brief overview of the Big Bang and steady-state cosmologies. As many of you here undoubtedly know, Big Bang cosmology depicts the universe as having an absolute beginning in time, the famous event designated T equals 0, approximately 13.8 billion years ago. This cosmology is rooted in Einstein's general theory of relativity, which he published circa 1916. Big Bang cosmology combines mathematical solutions to Einstein's theory of relativity by Alexander Friedmann, George Lemaitre, Howard Robinson, and Arthur Walker, and astronomical evidence by Erwin Hubble and colleagues for the motion of distant galaxies receding from Earth as velocities that increase linearly with their distance, Hubble's law. While Hoyle had a number of objections to Einstein's cosmology, the most important one, I believe, was that it portrayed the universe as having had an absolute beginning in time. Now, as I mentioned above, Hoyle was an outspoken atheist, and he was outraged that Big Bang cosmology, to which he had made major scientific contributions, was being used, perhaps co-opted, by Christians as support for the existence of God. A widely discussed instance was an address by Pope Pius XII to the Pontifical Academy of Sciences in 1951. Here the Pope claimed that Big Bang cosmology has, quote, confirmed the contingency of the universe and also the well-founded deduction as to the epoch when the world came forth from the hands of the Creator, i.e. T equals 0. Hence, creation took place. We say, therefore there is a Creator. Therefore God exists. Exclamation point. End quote. In response, Hoyle, Bondi, and Gold constructed what they call the steady-state cosmology. In this cosmology, the universe has no beginning in time. Instead, it is eternally old, and it has been expanding forever. In order to construct the steady-state cosmology, Hoyle took a remarkable step. He stepped back from Einstein's general relativity to create a theory that was in several important ways sharply different from Einstein's. In perhaps the most important difference, Hoyle assumed that the masses of elementary particles, like electrons and protons, increase in time. They are not constant, as we would normally presuppose. The implications were huge. For example, if particle masses increase in time, then measuring rods constructed out of them will shrink under the increased gravitational attraction between them. This in turn means that the distance between objects, as measured by these shrinking rods, will appear to increase in time. The stunning result is to do away with t equals 0. According to Hoyle's steady-state cosmology, the geometry of the universe is constant in time, even though it appears to be expanding, and this in turn means that the universe no longer has an absolute beginning. So how should we decide which cosmology to support? Steady state or Big Bang? Of course, the decision would ultimately be based on the discovery of new empirical data, and this happened when in 1964, Arnold Pezayas and Robert Wilson detect what we now call the cosmic microwave background radiation. But until then, scientists could not use empirical evidence to definitively choose between the Big Bang model and the steady-state model. Instead, in the debates over which cosmology to adopt, scientists often appealed to philosophical and even theological arguments, some of which were implicit, some of which were explicit. As historian of science Helga Craig notes, quote, "In the absence of crucial observational data, much interest was directed towards the philosophical foundations and implications of these theories. The one which showed the stronger philosophical basis would attract new support and appeal to more scientists. On the other hand, if one of the theories turned out to be less scientific than its rival, judged by criteria which necessarily must be philosophical, it would be likely to lose support." So now, with this as an overview, we may look briefly at the details of this debate. First at philosophical arguments, and then at theological ones over these cosmologies. So philosophical arguments actually in the debate. Hoyle repeatedly objected to the idea that a universe could simply begin at a finite time in the past. And here's his quote: "It is against the spirit of the scientific inquiry to regard observable effects," by which he meant the current state of the universe, "as arising from," scare quotes, "causes unknown to science," quote. And this is in principle what creation in the past implied. He believed that t equals 0 was, quote, "an irrational process that cannot be described in scientific terms. It seems to me," says Hoyle, "in the philosophical sense, to be a distinctly unsatisfactory notion, since it puts the basic assumption, i.e. an absolute beginning of the universe, out of sight where it can never be challenged by a direct appeal to observation." In contrast, Hoyle's steady-state theory portrayed the universe as infinitely old, expanding forever with no absolute beginning. For Hoyle, this was the only truly, quote, "rational," quote, "scientific picture of the universe." Now, a steady-state model had its own problems. For example, it required the continuous creation of matter in order to keep the mass density of the universe constant in time as the universe expanded. And this raised philosophical questions of its own. For example, George Vitae and Edward Milne argued that the continuous creation of matter in the steady-state model violated what's called Occam's razor, namely, that the simplest of competing theories should be preferred, clearly an aesthetic criteria in science. Thus, they preferred the Big Bang model with its single creation of matter at t equals 0 over Hoyle's continuous creation of matter. Let's look briefly at theological arguments as well. Here, Milne and Edmund Whittaker opted for the Big Bang because it seemed to support Christian theism. Whittaker even suggested that a Thomistic-style proof of God could be based on the Big Bang cosmology and its beginning and the beginning of the universe at t equals 0. although the creation itself, quote, being a unique event, is, of course, outside science altogether. End quote. This is a particularly vivid example of what Robert Boyle must have had in mind for his lectures. Conversely, Milne's goal was to construct a cosmology starting with and based on his Christian faith, faith leading science. For Milne, such a cosmology had to include a cosmic beginning point, t equals 0, reflecting the creation of the universe by a transcendent cause. Here, indeed, is another example of theology influencing theory construction in science. Other examples of such theological influence include W.H. McCrae, who defended Big Bang cosmology against steady state because it seemed to him to support Christian theism. But Bernard Lovell, a staunch Christian, argued for both Big Bang and steady state models. They were both in accord with Christian theology, because the creation of matter, whether at the absolute beginning in Big Bang cosmology or in the continuous creation of matter in the steady state, were ultimately due to an act of God. In sum, the world of scientific cosmology during the late 1940s through the 1960s was ripe with conflicting philosophical and theological arguments that motivated the choice by scientists between Big Bang and steady state. My overall point, again, is that when scientists debate the reasons guiding their research, both when constructing a theory and when choosing between competing theories, philosophical and theological views and insights routinely fund their reasons. Of course, the cosmic standoff would eventually be resolved. As I mentioned above, this happened dramatically with the discovery of the cosmic microwave background radiation by Penzias and Wilson in 1964. It was followed by several other astronomical discoveries, which cumulatively seemed to settle the matter in favor of Einstein for most scientists and philosophers. But did it do so conclusively? We'll return to this very surprising answer to the question at the end of tonight's lecture, so stay with me. So, to recap, so far we have discussed how philosophical and theological views influence the way scientists debated cosmology. Now let's turn to quantum mechanics and similar types of debates. First, briefly, the history of quantum mechanics starts with the discovery of energy quantization, that is, energy comes in discrete quantities, by Max Planck in 1900. Continues through the derivation of the Schrödinger wave equation in 1926, and culminates in the unification of the diverse formulations of quantum mechanics by David Hilbert, Paul Dirac, and John von Neumann in 1930. This history offers yet another example of the roles of both philosophy and theology as they enter subtly and indirectly into the debates by scientists about which models of subatomic processes to create, adopt, develop, support, and challenge. So, philosophical and theological arguments in this debate. We now turn directly to examples of the influence of philosophical and theological arguments on the development of quantum mechanics. As we just saw in cosmology, the influence is often sketchy, indirect, and anecdotal. But there are a few examples in which the influence is quite clear. So, for example, a key example is Erwin Schrödinger's fascination with Vedanta. According to Schrödinger, quote, "The multiplicity of nature is only apparent. This is the doctrine of the Upanishads, and not of the Upanishads only. The mystical experience of the unity with God regularly leads to this view, unless strong prejudices stand in its way," unquote. It was this view that led Schrödinger to portray the fundamental processes of nature at the quantum level in realist language, though the realism was at a very distinctive, shall we say, type. He supported real waves of probability undulating in mathematical space and reflecting mind as more fundamental than matter. Contrary to Schrödinger, Niels Bohr, an atheist, was deeply influenced by the existentialist philosophy of Soren Kierkegaard. He contended that nature at the quantum level is shrouded in mystery and that it cannot be represented without fundamental contradictions and limitations, which he expressed with the key concept of wave-particle complementarity. Note, Bohr adopted the yin-yang for his coat of arms. With its logos, opposites are complementary. His resulting Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, with its deeply anti-realist tendencies, still holds a dominant position amongst physicists. Finally, Albert Einstein was heavily influenced by the pantheism of Baruch Spinoza. Although he rejected a personal God as he moved away from the Judaism of his youth, he came to speak about a cosmic religion that was, quote, necessary for science, and he adamantly supported a realist and determinist view of physics, diametrically opposed to that of Bohr. With that in mind, let's drill down on one particularly well-known part of this debate over quantum mechanics, namely that taking place during the 1927 and 1930 Solvay conferences. I will focus briefly on the interchange between Niels Bohr, who defended the majority view, the Copenhagen interpretation, and Albert Einstein, who challenged it. Bohr had been a key contributor to the development of quantum mechanics for over 2 decades. Einstein was awarded the Nobel Prize for his explanation of the photoelectric effect, which demonstrated the particle-like aspects of light. As is well known, Bohr accepted the statistics of quantum mechanics as indicative of an underlying indeterminism in the properties of quantum systems, even when this indeterminism played out instantaneously over large distances. We now describe this phenomena as quantum non-locality and quantum entanglement. Einstein disdained both indeterminism and non-local action at a distance in quantum mechanics. Bohr and Einstein debated these issues at the Solvay conferences in 27 and 30, where most in attendance felt that Bohr's views took the upper hand. Einstein then shifted his position. Initially, he had claimed that the presence of statistical predictions, as reflected in Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, must mean that quantum mechanics is incorrect. Later in the 1930s, he moved to the claim that quantum mechanics is incomplete, not incorrect. In essence, there must be a sufficient natural cause to explain the apparent indeterminism of the data, which is clearly a philosophical commitment. Einstein spent the rest of his career pursuing this commitment, searching for a new and more adequate theory of atomic processes that was based on the causal closure of nature. The uptake for tonight's lecture is that even a theory as well validated empirically as quantum mechanics nevertheless includes striking differences by the interpretations of its founders, and these competing interpretations, structured by philosophical and theological arguments, shaped the way these scientists pursued their ongoing research programs throughout their entire career. It drove one group of scientists, Bohr and his supporters, to accept quantum mechanics as a complete theory, even when it challenged a realist philosophy of science. It led another group of scientists, Einstein and his followers, to search for a new quantum theory that would include and yet transcend the existing theory and remove its indeterministic character, thus satisfying Einstein's philosophical quest for realism in nature. On the one hand, for Bohr, it made no sense to ask what caused the statistical measurements of an elementary particle as reflected in Heisenberg's principle of indeterminism. Bohr simply accepted the limitations of quantum mechanics on what we can measure and he declared that quantum mechanics was a complete theory, one which told all that we know about elementary particles, even if that was unsatisfactory to a causal view such as Einstein's. On the other hand, Einstein, influenced by his early roots in Judaism, even while moving into a Spinozistic view of nature in his mature years, believed that a valid scientific theory should give a realist and deterministic explanation of nature without a trace of chance. And quantum mechanics obviously failed to do this. The upshot, these differences in the decisions about the scientific status of quantum mechanics by Bohr and Einstein were based in large measure on philosophical grounds and partially influenced by theology. The key is that in neither case were the conflicts between these interpretations of quantum mechanics, nor the different research programs these scientists pursued, resolvable by an appeal to the empirical data, then, and arguably even now a century later. It was not an empirically based debate. It was a philosophically based one. In my view, then, the conclusion is clear. When the data cannot adjudicate between competing theories, such as we have seen here in cosmology for 2 decades, and in quantum mechanics for over a century, it is entirely reasonable to rely on so-called extra scientific factors, namely philosophical, theological, even aesthetic ones, to act as criteria of theory choice between competing interpretations, as Einstein and Bohr did about quantum mechanics. This is, in fact, how theoretical science often works. We now need to acknowledge this fact and work with it, even if it challenges our presuppositions that science is rationally neutral to such extra scientific factors. Science's actual history dispels this foreshortened, over-rationalistic view, this myth of rationality. In essence, actual science research includes the influences of philosophical and theological elements in the formation of new theories and as criteria of theory choice between existing theories. So, moving towards conclusions. The 2 examples I have given of philosophical and theological influences in research scientists are admittedly historical examples. One might easily respond that they are little more than oddities of history. According to the conventional wisdom taught me as an undergraduate and in graduate courses in physics and reiterated by my seminary faculty in theology, the influence of philosophy and theology in scientific research inevitably, quote, fades out as competition between paradigms is settled and as winning theories become established and the ramification becomes what Thomas Kuhn called normal science. So as the conventional story goes, the debate over Big Bang and steady state died out in the 1960s with the discovery of the cosmic background radiation as overwhelming evidence favoring Big Bang. In a similar way, the debates over Einstein's and Bohr's views of quantum mechanics died out as a single formulation of quantum mechanics came to predominance in the 1930s. This view was given additional support by Bell's theorem in the 60s with its implications for quantum mechanics and has been taught in introductory physics courses around the world since then. In fact, I taught that at Carleton College. Mea culpa. But did the debates and their philosophical interpretations and their occasional theological underpinnings really die out? Or can we still find traces of them in the conflicting models physicists create and deploy today? And should Christian theologians be game to enter into the dialogue and work with scientists who might be open to this wider conversation, hoping to make suggestions that might have some positive influence in research science which reflect their deepest held theological commitments? Perhaps the best response to this question is to turn once again, very briefly, to what is actually taking place in contemporary research. We saw above that the routine claim that the discovery of the cosmic microwave background radiation ended the debate in favor of Big Bang cosmology in the 1960s, and that by the 1930s, quantum mechanics was given both a single mathematical formulation and a standard interpretation. But is that really the whole story? Actually, no. First, cosmology. It turns out that contemporary research stemming directly from Hoyle's steady-state program can still be found actively being pursued today. In the 1960s, Geraint Narlikar began working with Hoyle on a new theory of gravity. Like the original steady-state theory, the Hoyle-Narlikar theory does away with the problematic T equals 0, rooted in Einstein's Big Bang cosmology. Moreover, it addresses several problems with the initial steady-state model, the most important of which is that it provides an explanation of the microwave background discovered by Penzias and Wilson. Similarly, the debates in fundamental physics between the standard model of elementary particles and string theory, on the other hand, reflect ongoing unsettled philosophical issues dating back to the early years of quantum mechanics. So, for example, one of the debated questions is whether elementary particles are discrete, point-like entities in spacetime, so-called fundamental particles, or whether they are relations between entities that are extended in spacetime, so-called strings. A philosophical debate with its roots in the conflicting philosophies of Aristotle and Leibniz. So are there Christian theologians willing to enter into conversations with research scientists and explore whether theological commitments might be of interest to their research? I believe a clear example can be found in the writings of John Polkinghorne. As early as 1989, when discussing a non-interventionist account of divine action, John argued that such an account requires a genuine openness in nature, what's called in philosophy ontological indeterminism. At first, John seemed to argue that chaotic processes, so say the structure of the rings of Saturn, provide such indeterminism, that chaotic systems, quote, reflect an intrinsic openness in the behavior of these systems, unquote. But since the theory for which counts for them, standard chaos theory, is fully deterministic, it seemed like John's move wouldn't work. But in light of his distinguished Gifford lectures in the 1990s, I am convinced that John is actually moving in the opposite direction, not from science through philosophy to a theology of nature, as his slogan, Epistemology Models Ontology, suggests, but from a set of theological convictions about the world being open to God and to human action, which move from there back to science, where he sees, quote, the deterministic equations of standard chaos theory are deemed to be, quote, emergent downward approximations to the true supple physical reality, unquote. This move from theology to science reflects beautifully what I'm calling in this Boyle Lecture, natural theology in reverse. I see John as stipulating, based on his theological convictions, which I share, that nature must be intrinsically open. But he is not concluding that from existing theory. In essence, he can be seen as calling for us to explore a new scientific research program dealing with chaotic and complex systems in nature, but one which points to ontological determinism, genuine chance. Here, I can only heartily say, bravo, John. I applaud this approach and encourage its pursuit. A successful move from theology to new research in science, such as I read John suggesting, would provide a powerful vindication of the cognitive capability of theology to our scientifically informed contemporary culture. And an excellent example of one part of what I'm calling creative mutual interaction. In my own writings over the past decade, I have analyzed a series of scientific research programs in current science, which I believe are what one might adopt as a Christian scientist, if one believes the natural world is the creation of the Trinitarian God, as I do. I have focused specifically on understanding of the relation between time and nature and the eternity of God, based on Wolfhart Pannenberg's development of the Trinity in eschatology. This relation leads to the idea that physical time is more complex than the view of linear time we find throughout science and embedded in the calculus. Instead, it should be viewed as highly nonlinear, time should be viewed as highly nonlinear and multiply connected, reflecting the theological belief that the Easter event is the manifestation in history of the future coming new creation. I have then found dozens of research programs in physics that embody such a more complex view of time. Whether or not the physicists are aware is a different question. I see this as another example of CMI. And CMI, in turn, is one part of the mission of the Center for Theology and Natural Sciences. Its research and teaching programs involve a multitude of conversations between Christian theology in an explicitly ecumenical and interfaith context, and the whole sweep of contemporary natural science. I see these conversations as going in both directions, following my metaphor of the two-way traffic on the Golden Gate Bridge. I believe they can be of tremendous potential for the credibility and relevance of religion in our secular age. In addition, as CTNS, we invite and encourage scholars from all world religions to participate in these conversations and to discover things about nature which are of ultimate concern to our personal lives, to our global cultures, to our most profound experiences of the divine, the sacred, the transcendent, the mystical. I believe these conversations are immensely enhanced when they flow in both directions between the theological and scientific communities, as I hope I've suggested in this presentation. On that note, let me thank my hosts once again for their gracious invitation to address you tonight, for your patience in listening, and for the privilege of giving the 2017 Boyle Lectures. Thank you.
I'm deeply honored and very grateful to have the opportunity of responding to a lecture of this quality and originality. And it won't surprise you if I say that I feel somewhat out of my depth in this field. However, what I'd like to do in the few minutes of response and appreciation that have been allowed me is to identify some of the issues which I believe arise for our general understanding of the methodology of science itself, and some of the consequent challenges to theology to clarify its own agenda and priorities in response to this. What we have heard this evening from Professor Russell is a fundamental challenge to do with the very nature of knowledge and representation. A certain kind of popular scientism still dreams of what we might call a culture-free form of representation. That is a form of describing reality which is in no way infected by the questions we raise in other areas of our cognitive life, our social life, or our imaginative life. A form of representation which has nothing to do with our convictions. Similarly, there is a form of scientism that dreams of successfully atomizing the processes of discovery. It's possible to identify self-contained results from the processes of research which have no necessary connection with other parts of the territory. But what if there is no culture-free space? What if the way we formulate and prioritize our questions is rooted in what we have learned in other areas of activity, communication, and indeed conviction? It may have startled some of you to hear Professor Russell talking about the making of choices in scientific language. Surely, our instinct is to say, there's no choice about this. The scientist describes what she or he sees, and that's all there is to it. And yet, when scientific discovery is being communicated, people reach for culturally potent metaphors, metaphors which reinforce an imaginative and moral worldview. They reach for what we might perhaps unkindly call a metaphorical megaphone. So Richard Dawkins' famous image about genes operating within human organisms as some homunculus might operate in a great machine, pulling the levers and moving it around in order to secure its own purposes, is no innocent or culture-free metaphor. It is a highly morally charged version of the processes that are being described. Scientists do make choices. They assign priorities to the questions they tackle, and they reach for particular rhetorical strategies in communicating their results. This is not to undermine the objectivity of the scientific task, but it is at the very least to remind ourselves that the process of intellectual discovery, the scientific mapping of the territory in which we live as human beings, is, like all our human activity, enmeshed in a plurality of response. Just over 30 years ago, Michael Arbib and Mary Hesse collaborated in the delivery of an important series of Gifford lectures in the University of Edinburgh, subsequently published under the title The Construction of Reality. In an early chapter of this very significant book, they spell out the idea that we work in science as elsewhere by the construction of what they call schemata. A schema is a coherent map of a territory, not an independent and all-sufficient explanation or representation, but a set of strategies refined and polished over time as research activity moves on, but as research activity moves on in tandem with all the other things that human beings do and ask and think about. I quote, "Schemas are not to be seen as isolated monads. They are rather entities that interact with one another to model a complex situation, to mediate the organism's learning and to determine the organism's course of action. The action-perception cycle is also a learning cycle, as experience is matched against the structure of anticipations generated within the schema assemblage. The schemas of any individual themselves form a holistic network that represents the social network." Now, this is, of course, a thesis that is about how organisms learn and construct adequate strategies of coping with their immediate environment. But it's clear as the book advances that it's also being proposed as a way of thinking about scientific activity itself. No schema is a monad. We are looking towards a holistic network of interpretative strategies for inhabiting our world with a successful measure of intelligence. There's an inevitable dimension to this, as Professor Russell has indicated, which takes us beyond mere naturalism. And an obvious need, therefore, to extend our concepts of what will count as cognition. The approach that Arbib and Hesse suggest is, I believe, entirely congruent with the argument we've heard this evening from Professor Russell. Choices that are made around comprehensive schemes of interpretation and mapping are not evidentially determined in any simplistic way. Other kinds of support are quite rightly and regularly adduced for the options that we make. We come to know partly because of what we have learned to value, as well as what we have learned to picture. We choose our rhetoric and our metaphors in the light of that holistic network of understanding which we occupy simply as intelligent subjects. There is, you might say, no equal light on the landscape. What is picked out by a theory is going in its distinctiveness to depend on more than just the solving of these immediate problems. That, of course, is why debates around, for example, freedom and determinism are so beleaguered by philosophical confusion. Some would like to suppose that the neurological evidence makes it clear that there is no such thing as free choice because neural patterns are activated before an action is actually taken. Others have noted that the neurological experiments associated with this are already heavily loaded by the expectations of a deterministic result and an atomistic measurement of what constitutes action and decision. There is no culture-free space, once again. We might also think of the currently and probably lastingly insoluble debates about the existence of parallel universes. Because when you think about it, there is in the nature of the case no evidence available about alternative universes. Therefore, the role that they play in any comprehensive scientific picture is going to depend very heavily on the metaphysics and the ethics brought to bear. So much on how we define cognition, how we understand and misunderstand representation. But the final question which we're left with by this watershed presentation from Professor Russell is a challenge back to theology itself. What kinds of scientific question are indeed raised as worthwhile and worth pursuing by theology? We've had one example put before us. That is the need for a universe in which there is a certain openness in the causal system, a certain level of indeterminacy. But what other things might we expect to be present and challenging and interesting in the natural world if we begin from a Christian and theological perspective? We might, for example, expect to find holistic explanations rather than atomized ones the most persuasive. We might expect the teleological, the top-down interpretation to do more heavy lifting than more narrowly focused versions. We might expect, given what we say as Christians about the role of the Logos in the universe, that patterns of exchange of energy were always at the same time patterns of exchange of information. We might expect to find in the wonderful phrase of Professor Connor Cunningham that it's intelligence all the way down. We might expect certain understandings of time, as once again we have been reminded, to function more effectively than others. We might expect, and this is a theme which last year's Boyle Lecturer, Professor Sarah Coakley, my longtime colleague and friend, has taken a great interest in, we might expect that fundamentally cooperative, rather than competitive and rivalrous patterns, told us more about the universe than otherwise. We might want to tackle the extremely difficult questions about the nature of finite substance, particle or relation. We might want to dust off, on the theological side, Austin Farrer's comment that no religious metaphysic can do without a doctrine of finite substance, and dust off on the scientific side the work of David Bohm on the implicate order of the universe, and wrestle with the theological implications of both and what theology might have to say about whether substance is discrete or continuous. We might, of course, pick up the challenge laid down many years ago by Rupert Sheldrake as to what kinds of research programs could confirm or disconfirm intuitions and half-formed theories about otherwise inexplicable connections between the processes of learning in organisms. It's in those areas, I believe, that theology, clarifying its own implications, can suggest to the scientist, in just the way Professor Russell has outlined, where a constructive and original agenda might run. And in so doing, the basic challenge is this: it can't be science if it's generated by non-empirical observation. And yet, the processes of discovery are culturally shaped. We learn what, for whatever reason, we want to learn. That certainly doesn't mean that what we learn is not truth. But it does mean a certain kind of epistemological humility in understanding that knowledge wears many guises, that cognition is not a single, straightforward process of problem solving, and that the glory and richness of what we as human beings call knowledge is not to be reduced to any one set of practices. Professor Russell has opened up a rich vein of reflection in relation to all these issues. And it's a privilege for me to be able, on behalf of what I can see as a deeply appreciative audience, to express our warmest thanks to him for this deeply important contribution to a subject which will not cease to engage all of us.